Good evening. Tonight, we begin with something as extraordinary and strategically significant as it is deeply revealing about Russian military incompetence and strategic miscalculation. Russia attempted to interdict Ukraine's vital supply of HIMARS rocket systems and ammunition by striking transportation routes, bombing rail infrastructure, and targeting Western weapons convoys, moving from Poland through Western Ukraine toward the front lines. The operation was Russia's most comprehensive and sustained effort to cut Ukrainian access to the precision weapons that have devastated Russian ammunition depots, command posts, and logistics hubs for over 2 years. But the interdiction campaign failed catastrophically and completely, accomplishing absolutely nothing except forcing NATO to develop far more robust and diversified supply routes that are now far more difficult for Russia to disrupt than the original logistics system was. Think about that. For nearly 3 years, Russia has struggled to counter the impact of American-supplied HIMARS multiple rocket launcher systems that enable Ukrainian forces to strike Russian targets up to 80 kilometers behind front lines, with precision that Russian forces cannot match. HIMARS has destroyed hundreds of Russian ammunition depots and logistics facilities, eliminated dozens of command posts, killed thousands of Russian soldiers in barracks and assembly areas, and forced Russian logistics to operate far behind front lines, where inefficiency creates supply problems that degrade combat effectiveness. But tonight, as NATO officials confirm that Russia's interdiction campaign not only failed to reduce HIMARS supply, but actually triggered Western development of redundant supply networks far more resilient than what existed before, Russia's attempt to solve its HIMARS problem has made that problem dramatically worse. This is not about failed tactical operations. It's about strategic incompetence, where Russia's response to a capability gap made that gap larger rather than smaller, where attempts to disrupt Ukrainian advantages triggered Western responses that expanded those advantages beyond what Ukraine possessed before Russia attempted interdiction. Russia has effectively said, "We cannot counter HIMARS through military means, so we'll attack the supply routes." NATO responded, "Thank you for identifying vulnerabilities we should fix," and built logistics infrastructure so robust that Russia can no longer threaten it meaningfully. That's not just operational failure. That's strategic disaster where enemy responses to your actions leave you worse off than if you'd done nothing. For over a century, interdiction campaigns targeting enemy supply lines have represented critical elements of military strategy where disrupting logistics can degrade enemy combat power more effectively than fighting enemy forces directly. World War I saw extensive and increasingly desperate efforts by both sides to disrupt enemy supplies through submarine warfare, strategic bombing in its earliest forms, and partisan attacks on rail lines deep behind front lines. Germany's unrestricted submarine campaign represented the most ambitious interdiction effort of the war, aiming to starve Britain into submission by sinking merchant ships carrying food, raw materials, and military supplies across the Atlantic Ocean. German U-boats operated in packs hunting British merchant vessels, believing that cutting Britain's maritime lifelines would force British surrender more quickly and decisively than defeating British armies in the costly trench warfare that had stalemated on the Western Front. The campaign achieved significant tactical success, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping during 1917 when unrestricted submarine warfare reached its peak intensity. At certain points, German submarines were destroying ships faster than British shipyards could build replacements, creating genuine concerns in London that supplies might be strangled completely before American entry into the war could offset the losses. British civilians faced food rationing as agricultural imports declined sharply, and industrial production suffered from shortages of raw materials that normally arrived by sea. But the submarine campaign ultimately failed to prevent sufficient supplies from reaching Britain to sustain the war effort because the Allies developed effective countermeasures, including the convoy system that grouped merchant ships with naval escorts, improved submarine detection technologies including hydrophones and depth charges, and increased shipbuilding capacity in American yards that eventually replaced losses faster than submarines could sink ships. By late 1918, the convoy system had reduced submarine effectiveness so dramatically that German U-boats could no longer inflict economically decisive losses, despite maintaining large submarine fleet. The campaign's failure demonstrated that interdiction's success requires not just inflicting damage, but preventing the target from adapting through countermeasures that negate the attacker's methods. World War II elevated interdiction to industrial scale as air forces conducted systematic campaigns against enemy transportation networks, attempting to prevent troops and supplies from reaching front lines. The Allied transportation plan before D-Day targeted French and Belgian rail systems to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy beaches after invasion began. Allied aircraft destroyed rail yards, bridges, locomotives, and rolling stock in operations that significantly degraded German ability to move reserves quickly. The interdiction campaign demonstrated that systematic attacks on transportation infrastructure could create operational advantages even when campaigns didn't completely sever supply routes. The Vietnam War saw the most extensive and sustained American interdiction effort of the 20th century against North Vietnamese supply routes through Laos and Cambodia, collectively known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. American forces conducted massive bombing campaigns spanning nearly a decade, dropping millions of tons of ordnance, attempting to cut North Vietnamese logistics, supporting communist forces fighting in South Vietnam. The interdiction effort employed the most advanced military technology available, including B-52 strategic bombers conducting saturation bombing, F-4 Phantom fighter bombers dropping precision-guided munitions on identified targets, AC-130 gunships with sensors that could detect truck movement at night, and electronic sensors scattered along trails that reported enemy activity. Despite enormous resources devoted to interdiction operations, including thousands of aircraft sorties monthly, hundreds of pilots and aircraft lost, and expenditure of munitions exceeding all bombs dropped in World War II, North Vietnamese forces continued moving sufficient supplies south to sustain military operations throughout the war at levels that prevented South Vietnamese and American forces from achieving decisive military victory. The campaign's comprehensive failure demonstrated that even the most technologically advanced military employing unprecedented firepower cannot sever logistics of determined enemies who possess will to accept casualties, ability to repair damage quickly, and creativity to develop countermeasures, including dispersed routes, nighttime movement, extensive camouflage, and anti-aircraft defenses that made interdiction increasingly costly. North Vietnamese logistics personnel developed sophisticated methods for maintaining supply flow despite constant American attacks, including building multiple parallel routes so that bombing one path didn't prevent movement on alternatives, conducting most transportation at night when American aircraft had more difficulty locating targets, employing tens of thousands of workers to repair bomb damage so quickly that roads destroyed by morning airstrikes were operational again by evening, and creating elaborate camouflage, including false truck parks and dummy supply depots that American aircraft attacked wastefully, while actual supplies moved safely on hidden routes. The North Vietnamese adaptation demonstrated that interdiction fails when targets possess greater capacity to repair and adapt than attackers possess capacity to inflict sustained damage. The Gulf War, in 1991, featured successful interdiction as coalition air forces systematically destroyed Iraqi transportation infrastructure, including bridges, rail lines, and highways that connected Iraqi forces in Kuwait to supply bases in Iraq. The interdiction campaign isolated Iraqi forces, preventing resupply and reinforcement during the ground campaign that liberated Kuwait. Iraqi forces surrendered in large numbers partially because interdiction had severed their logistics, demonstrating that overwhelming air superiority enables effective interdiction when enemies lack means to defend, supply routes, or develop alternative logistics. When the United States began supplying HIMARS to Ukraine in June 2022, Russian military planners immediately recognized the threat precision rocket systems posed to Russian logistics and command infrastructure. HIMARS could strike targets that Russian air defenses couldn't protect effectively, using GPS-guided rockets that hit targets with accuracy measured in meters rather than the dozens or hundreds of meters that unguided rockets required. The first HIMARS strikes destroyed Russian ammunition depots, storing thousands of artillery shells and rockets that Ukrainian forces had previously been unable to reach with their own artillery. The impact on Russian operations was immediate and severe. Russian forces had positioned ammunition depots relatively close to front lines to minimize transportation time and maintain high rates of artillery fire that Russian tactics depended upon. When HIMARS strikes began destroying these forward depots, Russian logistics officers had to move ammunition storage further back, increasing transportation distances and reducing the rate at which ammunition could be delivered to artillery batteries. Russian artillery fire rates declined measurably after HIMARS forced logistics reorganization. Russian attempts to counter HIMARS through air defense and electronic warfare achieved limited success because HIMARS operates from positions far behind Ukrainian front lines and fires rockets that fly ballistic trajectories at speeds and altitudes that make interception extremely difficult with the air defense systems Russia had deployed. Russian forces attempted to locate and destroy HIMARS launchers through counter-battery fire and airstrikes, but Ukrainian forces employed shoot-and-scoot tactics, firing rockets and immediately moving to different positions before Russian forces could respond. Frustrated by inability to counter HIMARS directly through military means, Russian planners apparently decided to attack the problem at its source by interdicting HIMARS supply routes from Poland through western Ukraine toward front lines in eastern and southern Ukraine. The interdiction campaign involved missile and drone strikes against rail infrastructure, road bridges, and logistics hubs in western Ukraine where Western weapons transited toward combat zones. Russian forces launched dozens of strikes attempting to destroy weapons convoys, disable transportation networks, and create bottlenecks that would prevent HIMARS ammunition from reaching Ukrainian forces. The campaign failed comprehensively for multiple reasons that Russian planners apparently didn't adequately consider before launching it. Western Ukraine's transportation infrastructure includes multiple redundant routes, including rail lines, highways, and secondary roads that provide alternative paths if primary routes are damaged. Striking one bridge or rail yard doesn't prevent transportation. It merely forces logistics to use different routes that add time but don't eliminate capability to move supplies. Creating meaningful disruption would require sustained attacks on dozens of targets simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers, an operational tempo that Russian forces couldn't maintain given competing demands for missiles and drones in combat zones. Ukrainian air defenses in western Ukraine proved far more effective than Russian planners expected, shooting down significant percentages of missiles and drones before they reached targets. Western air defense systems, including Patriots and IRIS-T that NATO provided specifically to protect logistics infrastructure, performed exceptionally well, intercepting Russian attacks with success rates that made the interdiction campaign economically unsustainable, as Russia expended expensive missiles to achieve minimal damage. And yet, here's the critical failure that transformed Russia's interdiction attempt from unsuccessful operation into strategic disaster. When Russia began striking supply routes, NATO responded not by accepting the disruption, but by massively expanding logistics infrastructure to create redundancy, far exceeding what existed before the interdiction campaign began. Poland and NATO members bordering Ukraine invested billions in new rail connections, highway improvements, and logistics facilities that multiplied the number of routes available for moving weapons and ammunition into Ukraine. This is where Russian strategic thinking failed catastrophically. Because interdiction campaigns only succeed if the target lacks resources or will to repair damage and develop alternatives. But striking supply routes that NATO was using to provide weapons to Ukraine didn't just damage logistics. It created political pressure on NATO to ensure those logistics couldn't be disrupted, triggering investments that made Ukrainian supply lines far more resilient than Russian planners intended. Russia solved NATO's logistics vulnerabilities by forcing NATO to fix them. There's a misconception in Russian military planning that attacking a problem demonstrates action and resolve, even when the attack makes the problem worse. But competent strategy requires assessing whether actions will achieve intended effects or trigger enemy responses that create worse situations than existed before. Russia's interdiction campaign clearly falls in the latter category. An operation that not only failed to achieve its objective, but that triggered responses making the original problem far more difficult to address. From the outside, attacking enemy supply routes appears logical because logistics are essential and disrupting them should degrade combat power. But if you examine what happens when attacks on supply routes trigger massive investments to protect those routes, you recognize that unsuccessful interdiction can be worse than no interdiction because it focuses enemy attention on vulnerabilities and motivates fixes that create more robust systems than existed originally. When NATO members began expanding logistics infrastructure in direct response to Russian interdiction attempts, the investments included not just repairing damaged facilities or replacing destroyed equipment, but building entirely new capabilities, designed specifically and intentionally to resist future Russian attacks while simultaneously increasing throughput capacity beyond pre-war levels. New rail connections were constructed that bypassed geographic and infrastructure choke points that Russian military planners had identified as vulnerable and had targeted in initial interdiction strikes, creating alternative routes that Russian intelligence might not even have fully cataloged or understood. Highway improvements included not just repairing damaged roads, but widening key routes, strengthening bridges to handle heavier military vehicles, and building bypass roads around cities where congestion had previously created potential bottlenecks. Logistics hubs and warehousing facilities were hardened with protective barriers, including reinforced concrete walls, earthen berms to absorb blast effects from missile strikes, and distributed layouts that prevented single strikes from destroying entire facilities. Air defense systems were deployed around critical logistics infrastructure with overlapping coverage that made successful attacks extremely difficult and costly for Russian forces attempting to strike supply routes. The comprehensive improvements created logistics networks with redundancy and resilience, far exceeding what commercial transportation infrastructure normally requires. But exactly what military supply lines need to function reliably when operating under threat of enemy interdiction. Poland specifically invested billions of euros in expanding rail capacity at border crossings with Ukraine, building new cargo handling facilities that could process military equipment more efficiently than civilian infrastructure allowed, and upgrading highways connecting Polish logistics centers to Ukrainian border crossings. These Polish investments reflected recognition that supporting Ukraine required infrastructure capable of handling sustained high-volume military logistics rather than the lower-capacity commercial transportation that had existed before the war. The investments will serve Polish and NATO interests for decades, regardless of how the war in Ukraine ultimately concludes. Here's the first hook. What makes this so extraordinary is not just that Russia's interdiction campaign failed to reduce HIMARS supply, but that it triggered NATO investments, creating logistics infrastructure far more capable and resilient than what existed before Russia attempted interdiction. Russian military planning identified Ukrainian logistics as vulnerability worth attacking, but failed to consider that attacking would motivate exactly the response that would eliminate that vulnerability permanently. The campaign represents strategic failure where enemy action makes you worse off than if you'd done nothing. The genius of NATO's response lies in recognizing that Russian interdiction attempts revealed weaknesses that needed addressing regardless of whether attacks succeeded in disrupting supply in the short term. Rather than simply repairing damage, NATO treated the interdiction campaign as opportunity to fundamentally improve Ukrainian logistics infrastructure and create redundancy that would serve Ukraine for years, regardless of whether Russia continued interdiction attempts. The response transformed tactical problem into strategic opportunity. Military strategists studying this campaign recognize it as an example of how unsuccessful operations can be more damaging than no operations when they trigger enemy responses that worsen the original situation. Russia would have been better off accepting that HIMARS posed problems, but that attacking supply routes wasn't a viable solution. Instead, the interdiction campaign wasted resources, accomplished nothing meaningful, and motivated NATO responses that made HIMARS supply more robust and reliable than before. What's truly remarkable about this failure is how it reveals fundamental gaps in Russian strategic assessment and planning processes. Competent military planning requires wargaming enemy responses to your operations and assessing whether those responses might negate your intended effects or create worse situations. Russian planners apparently never adequately considered that NATO might respond to interdiction attempts by expanding logistics infrastructure beyond Russia's capability to threaten. For months, the evidence has been accumulating through reports of increased weapons deliveries to Ukraine, satellite imagery showing new logistics facilities under construction in Poland and Western Ukraine, and NATO statements about investments in infrastructure supporting Ukraine aid. Russian interdiction attempts not only failed to reduce weapons flow, but actually correlated with increased delivery rates, as NATO prioritized ensuring that logistics couldn't be disrupted by future Russian attacks. But here's the truth that this failure exposes about Russian military competence. The interdiction campaign wasn't a sophisticated operation employing innovative tactics and unprecedented capabilities. It was straightforward missile strikes against obvious targets using conventional methods that any competent planner could have predicted would fail, against determined opposition possessing adequate air defenses and resources to develop alternative routes. The operation's obviousness makes its approval puzzling unless Russian decision-makers fundamentally misunderstood NATO's commitment to supporting Ukraine. Let's be clear about what this interdiction failure means for Russian strategic position. Russia cannot solve its HIMARS problem through supply interdiction because NATO has now built logistics infrastructure specifically designed to resist interdiction attempts. The window where attacking supply routes might have created meaningful disruption closed permanently when NATO responded to initial attacks by hardening infrastructure and creating redundancy. Russia's best opportunity to disrupt HIMARS supply existed before they attempted interdiction and revealed to NATO exactly what vulnerabilities needed addressing. Ukrainian forces have documented continued reliable HIMARS ammunition supply through operations maintaining strike rates against Russian targets, despite interdiction campaign attempting to cut off supply. Ukrainian statements thank NATO for ensuring logistics infrastructure can sustain operations regardless of Russian interdiction attempts. The evidence overwhelmingly confirms that the interdiction campaign failed to achieve its objectives and that NATO responses have permanently eliminated whatever vulnerability might have existed. Think about that. Russia identified that Ukrainian HIMARS posed serious problems for Russian operations, correctly assessed that HIMARS depended on steady ammunition supply from NATO, but then launched interdiction campaign so obvious and ineffective that it accomplished nothing except motivating NATO to build logistics infrastructure immune to future interdiction attempts. The strategic incompetence is almost difficult to comprehend. Here's the second hook. You cannot disrupt enemy supply lines through interdiction campaigns when the enemy possesses resources and will to repair damage, develop alternative routes, and harden infrastructure against future attacks. You cannot achieve strategic effects through operations so obvious that enemies can easily counter them by applying resources you cannot match. Every missile Russia wastes on unsuccessful interdiction is a missile not available for combat operations, and every NATO dollar invested in logistics infrastructure that Russia motivated through failed interdiction makes Ukrainian operations more sustainable for years to come. The broader implications extend beyond HIMARS. specifically to fundamental questions about Russian military competence and strategic planning processes. If Russian planners couldn't foresee that interdiction attempts would trigger NATO responses eliminating vulnerability, what other operations might Russia attempt that similarly backfire? The failure suggests systemic problems in how Russia assesses operations and anticipates enemy responses. And now comes the bitter irony. Russia launched this interdiction campaign specifically because HIMARS was devastating Russian logistics and command infrastructure, hoping to solve the problem by cutting HIMARS supply. But the campaign's failure means Russia still faces the HIMARS threat with no viable countermeasures, while simultaneously having wasted resources on interdiction that achieved nothing and having motivated NATO to build infrastructure, ensuring HIMARS supply continues indefinitely, regardless of Russian actions. International military observers watching this debacle recognize it as validation of principles about interdiction requiring overwhelming force, sustained pressure, and lack of viable alternatives for the target. Russia attempted interdiction without any of these prerequisites against opponent, with resources and commitment to maintain supply regardless of Russian attacks. The predictable failure demonstrates that interdiction isn't viable strategy when fundamental preconditions aren't met. There's something profoundly revealing about how Russian military planning approved this campaign, despite obvious indicators it would fail. Either Russian planners genuinely believed they could disrupt NATO supply routes through conventional missile strikes against infrastructure NATO could easily defend or replace, or they felt compelled to demonstrate action against HIMARS problem, even when analysis indicated action would fail. Both possibilities reflect poorly on Russian strategic competence. In the theater of modern warfare, logistics interdiction represents one of many tools available for degrading enemy combat power, but only when applied under conditions where it can succeed. Russian attempt to interdict HIMARS supply demonstrated every way interdiction can fail. Insufficient force to overcome defenses, inability to sustain pressure over time, enemy resources exceeding attackers' ability to cause lasting damage, and enemy responses that eliminate vulnerabilities the campaign attempted to exploit. Here's the third hook. Sometimes in military operations, the most damaging failures are those that not only fail to achieve objectives, but that trigger enemy responses, making the original problem worse. Russian interdiction campaign represents exactly this category, operation that failed to disrupt HIMARS supply while motivating NATO to build logistics infrastructure far more robust than what existed before Russia attempted interdiction. The net effect leaves Russia facing larger HIMARS threat than if they'd never attempted interdiction at all. The operational implications compound as Ukrainian HIMARS continue striking Russian targets with ammunition flowing through logistics networks that Russia can no longer meaningfully threaten. Every successful HIMARS strike represents capability that Russia tried and failed to eliminate through interdiction, demonstrating to Russian forces that their military leadership cannot protect them from precision strikes that have killed thousands of Russian soldiers and destroyed billions in military equipment. Russian commanders face impossible situations trying to protect logistics from HIMARS strikes when they cannot prevent HIMARS ammunition from reaching Ukrainian forces. They can disperse logistics to make targeting more difficult, but that creates inefficiencies that reduce combat effectiveness. They can defend logistics with air defenses, but Ukrainian forces employ tactics that overwhelm defenses. They can accept losses as inevitable cost of operations, but continual losses degrade morale and create supply problems. Every option creates difficulties that the failed interdiction campaign was supposed to eliminate. And yet, what makes this failure even more remarkable is how it demonstrates Russian inability to learn from historical examples of interdiction campaigns that failed under similar circumstances. Vietnam War interdiction of Ho Chi Minh Trail provides clear example that determined opponents with resources can maintain logistics despite sustained interdiction efforts. Russian planners apparently either didn't study this history or believed their circumstances were somehow different in ways that would produce success where previous campaigns failed. Something deeper than tactical military failure is unfolding through this debacle. Something about Russian strategic culture that apparently values action over analysis, that launches operations without adequately assessing likelihood of success, that fails to anticipate enemy responses that negate intended effects. The interdiction campaign represents systematic problems in how Russia makes strategic decisions and evaluates military operations. For the first time in this war, Russia has attempted major operation against Western supply lines, supporting Ukraine, and failed so completely that the operation made the problem worse rather than better. Previous Russian operations might have failed to achieve objectives, but this interdiction campaign represents qualitatively different failure because it triggered responses that fundamentally strengthened what Russia attempted to weaken. Western security observers see this failure as indication that Russian military competence has degraded to point where strategic planning cannot adequately assess operations before launch or anticipate obvious enemy responses. The interdiction campaign's approval, despite its predictable failure, suggests problems at highest levels of Russian military decision-making, where either analysis is inadequate or leaders ignore analysis when it indicates operations they want to attempt will fail. Here's the fourth hook. When your response to enemy capability makes that capability more sustainable and robust than before you attempted to counter it, when your interdiction campaign triggers investments that permanently eliminate vulnerabilities you tried to exploit, when your military planning cannot foresee obvious enemy responses that negate your operations before they begin, you demonstrate strategic incompetence so severe that doing nothing would serve your interests better than taking actions that make your position worse. Russian interdiction campaign against HIMARS supply represents this level of failure completely. The lesson is as old as military strategy, but worth restating. Operations should only be attempted when analysis indicates reasonable probability of success, and when failure won't trigger enemy responses that worsen your position. Russia attempted interdiction without either precondition being met, producing predictable failure that NATO exploited to eliminate what vulnerability might have existed. The strategic incompetence is remarkable. This campaign, failed as it was from inception, has exposed fundamental weaknesses in Russian strategic planning and demonstrated that Russia cannot solve its HIMARS problem through any means currently available. The operational failure combines with strategic backfire to leave Russia facing more capable Ukrainian forces supplied through logistics infrastructure. Russia can no longer meaningfully threaten regardless of resources devoted to future interdiction attempts. And that's what makes this development so powerful beyond immediate operational failure. Because at its core, this isn't about one failed interdiction campaign or specific logistics routes. It's about fundamental Russian inability to conduct strategic planning that anticipates enemy responses and that refrains from operations that make situations worse. Russia's HIMARS problem exists because Ukrainian forces employ American weapons effectively. Russian attempt to solve the problem by attacking supply routes not only failed but made the problem worse by triggering NATO infrastructure investments that ensure HIMARS supply continues regardless of Russian actions. The failure represents strategic incompetence at highest levels. Russia's failed interdiction sends messages about military competence and strategic assessment capability. The obvious operation failed predictably. NATO exploited failure to strengthen Ukrainian logistics permanently. Russian planning either couldn't foresee this outcome or launched operation despite foreseeing failure. Every possibility reflects poorly on Russian strategic competence and suggests that Russia will continue making decisions that worsen its position rather than improve it. So tonight, as Ukrainian HIMARS continue striking Russian targets, with ammunition flowing through logistics networks far more robust than existed before Russia attempted interdiction, as NATO officials confirm that Russian attacks motivated infrastructure investments, creating permanent supply resilience, as Russian military planning stands exposed as incapable of anticipating obvious consequences of its own operations, perhaps there's a lesson worth stating clearly. You can attempt to solve problems through military operations, but you cannot ignore whether operations will succeed or trigger responses, making problems worse. You can attack enemy supply routes, but you cannot prevent determined opponents with superior resources from maintaining logistics despite your attacks. And you can launch interdiction campaigns hoping to degrade enemy capabilities, but you cannot avoid the reality that unsuccessful interdiction, triggering enemy infrastructure investments, leaves you facing more capable opponent than before you attempted operations that any competent strategic assessment would have predicted would fail and backfire catastrophically. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.